Howdy, namaste, and welcome to this philosophical quest. My name is Brad, and I've been a philosophy professor since 2015. And after I taught the first couple hundred students or so, I realized that I really wanted to write a textbook, like an introduction to philosophy textbook. But then I realized a couple of problems. One is that my students don't really read what I assign them. I mean, some do, of course. But a lot of them don't. And even when students would read the text that I assigned, a lot of times they just really struggle to sort of understand them. So people have very short attention spans these days, and it's hard to stay focused. It's hard to really absorb things. People are so used to video and a lot of other kind of forms of gaining information that I wanted to write a book, right? A philosophical quest that's filled with basic tools that help you to make better decisions, that help you to think clearly and critically and that kind of stuff, and then learn how to apply those tools in a meaningful way, in second unit on like application, and then most importantly, that last section on like ethics and how to lead a good life and how to make decisions and that sort of thing about your life. But I wanted to do it in a way that that really held people's attention, so that when I'm constantly competing with attention with people who are checking their DMs or viewing their likes and mentions on whatever social media platform or whatever, or checking out the latest bubble butt video that was just uploaded on TikTok, those sorts of things. So this, you got to keep things interesting, you got to keep things moving, and books, just for a lot of people, especially philosophy books, just aren't going to do it. So I wanted to try and write a philosophy book, right, as an intro, but in video form, right? So it's a video book. So that's what this is. It also frees up me and my students who are taking classes with me to be able to have a lot more discourse, right? So to be able to, because philosophy is a mode of discourse for the sake of training the intellect by cultivating a desire for wisdom and truth through inspiration. That, you could say, is like the thesis of this book, The Philosophical Quest, and of this course. And that's not the first, that's the first time, but it's not the last time in this video that I'm going to give you that definition. There's a thing about philosophy is it can really help us to see things from a radically new perspective. Sometimes we just need to see the world around us from a differing perspective, and when we do that, then it can really change how we think about ourselves and how we think about the world and that sort of thing. And it can also, give us new ways of understanding ourselves, right? And new ways of understanding what's the meaning and purpose of life and why are we here. And one of the ways that discourse, right? Philosophy is a mode of discourse, discussion, right? So when we have discourse with one another, and we have discourse with these great minds of the present and past and that sort of thing, then it helps us to think about ourselves and why are we here and what's the meaning and purpose of life. And it helps us to make better decisions because we're better informed, right? So philosophy is something that's very useful in our lives, and philosophy should give us the tools to help us to do those things, right? To make better decisions, to understand ourselves better, and to lead a life that is rewarding and fulfilling and free, right? And those sorts of things. So I try to keep things interesting, right? Because I know that demands, we live in an economy of attention where you're constantly bombarded from every direction on all sorts of things that demand your attention. And so, one of the things I do is try to shift things up so that it's not just me standing in front of a chalkboard all the time, but sometimes I'll be in front of a light board, or sometimes I'll be in front of using PowerPoint or that sort of thing. So, but also not just giving you the tools. This is like the fundamental tool of this course, of this video book, I call systematic philosophy. But engaging music and musicians and media and all kinds of things. So we're going to talk about, YouTubers like Sadhguru and PewDiePie, and we'll talk about lots of musicians, Lou Reed, Tribe Called Quest, Mac Miller, Marshall Mathers, Billie Eilish, Royce the 5'9", a long list, Scott McCreery and Tim McGraw and Dierks Bentley, Logic. We're gonna have a lot of good music that we'll engage with in the class. It may not always be the kind of music that you really like, but it's not a music appreciation class, it's a philosophy class, right? And sometimes these musicians and these kind of things can like light a candle in the darkness that help us to make our way more clearly. And why would somebody light a lantern in the bright morning hours? Have you not heard of the madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours and went around in the marketplace getting in everybody's face and saying, "I seek God, I seek God"? I'm quoting, of course, from Friedrich Nietzsche, who was not making that up, but instead was quoting from another philosopher, Diogenes of Sinope, who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours and went and got in everybody's faces and said, "I seek an honest person." Diogenes thought that most people were full of shit, thought most people were fake, lacked genuineness. He thought that most people just didn't have a high opinion of humans. And so that's why he was like going around with this lantern saying, "I seek an honest, genuine person." So we'll talk about some of these madmen like Diogenes and Friedrich Nietzsche and that kind of stuff. We'll use metaphors like lanterns and trying to find our way out of the darkness, all in the hopes of trying to understand what does it mean to be free. You know, like I said, we're surrounded by philosophy. For example, here's my Jeep, right? And right there on the back of my Jeep is a philosophy, right? Right there on the license plate, "Live free or die," right? So this is the motto, state of New Hampshire. We put philosophy right on the license plate. And I think actually a lot of states kind of do that, put their own philosophy on their license plate. So we're surrounded by philosophy, but a lot of times we don't pause and really ask and question, like, what does it mean to be free, right? What do we mean by freedom? Now, we could say, obviously, on one level, freedom is physical freedom, right? I've got to be physically free. Brittany Griner or something like that is lacking that sort of physical freedom, right? They're imprisoned for whatever reason. So we want physical freedom. We want the ability to have autonomy and control of our own body, to make decisions about our own body, right? So that's one level of freedom. But also freedom of thought, right? Freedom of our mind. So a lot of times we live in these prisons, mental prisons, right? Bob Marley talks about that, right? To be emancipate yourself from mental slavery, right? These sort of modes of thought and ways of thinking that have become so dominant in our pervading philosophy in our society that we don't even realize that we're imprisoned, right? That's part of the point of lighting lanterns in the bright morning hours. Everybody thinks that the light comes from the sun, which it does on an external physical level, but then what about that light from within, the light and hope, the light that comes from something else, right? So we can think about freedom on lots of different levels: physical freedom, mental freedom, spiritual freedom, freedom of the heart and freedom of the soul, that kind of stuff, right? And so we'll explore these things in this philosophical quest and try and think not just about, you know, esoteric sort of like, we're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about what all these other philosophers said or think. We're not going to do a lot of philosophyology in this course. I'll talk about what that means later, but instead really think about philosophy as a way of life, as a way of helping us to make better decisions, as a way of helping us to find our own path in this world, find a way, ways to make decisions that give our lives meaning and purpose, right? To help us figure out, who am I, where am I, and why am I here? So those three fundamental questions philosophers like me refer to as the first principles of philosophy. So those first principles of philosophy: who am I, where am I, why am I here? We'll give them fancy names, you know, like philosophical anthropology and cosmology and existentialism. But at the end of the day, the point of studying all these things is to help us to understand ourselves and help us to understand the world around us and help us to understand our meaning and purpose so that we can live a life that is free, and so that we can live a life that is filled with meaning and purpose and that is fulfilling, right? A life that leads to happiness. Another philosopher, Aristotle said, you know, that's the whole point, right? It's to lead a life that's filled with happiness. If you lead a life where you're not happy, then I don't know, that can't be a good life, right? So we'll think about things like freedom, happiness, joy, fulfillment, and not just on physical levels, but also, you know, in terms of mental, emotional, and spiritual, right? We'll talk about anxiety and depression and what does philosophy have to do with those things. You know, at the end of the day, it is still a quest, right? It's a quest that only begins in this video book. It's a quest that certainly continues in our discussions with one another and that sort of thing, but it's got to start somewhere. And so this is just the preface. We're not even really starting yet, but I'm just kind of introducing you to myself and like my ways of thinking and that sort of thing, right? But we've got to start somewhere. And so we're going to start by framing everything in the right, getting everything in the right frame of mind, right? So that we're approaching philosophy and we're approaching this philosophical quest in a way that's most conducive to really learning something new and really seeing the world and seeing ourselves from a new perspective, right? To give you some sort of value in that sort of way. So we're going to start here. I'm going to start here at my pond, and we're going to start, like I said, philosophy is a mode of discourse for the sake of training the intellect by cultivating a desire for truth and wisdom through inspiration. So we'll talk about inspiration and spirit later in the course, but at the core level, the word spirit means breath, right? Kind of breathing in, breathing out, being in the moment, clearing of one's head, being in the moment, and clearing our head, preparing our bodies, preparing our minds, preparing our hearts to learn something new. So that's where this philosophical quest is going to begin. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you take something out of it, and I hope it holds your attention long enough to be able to think introspectively about yourself, this world around us, and how to live a life that's filled with meaning, purpose, and fulfillment, and happiness, and joy. Namaste.